If anything happened to that nuclear plant, it affects Russia as well. Prevailing winds would take any radioactivity from Zaporizhzhia right into the heartland.
What do you make of that warning that you heard there from Vladimir Klitschko, who's been out there on the front line, and his concerns about what might happen at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant?
It's all very worrying indeed, because the implications of a nuclear power plant being in the center of a battle must concern all of us. But the United Nations is involved. The Russians have now acquiesced to the idea of international inspectors getting to the site. And that must be of some reassurance to us that at least the Russians recognize the dangers that are now involved here. And the presence of international observers will have a very significant effect. Your world attention is now focused on that. So I don't think that the Russians are going to do anything aggressive if they've now allowed inspectors to get into the site.
Well, they've said they're going to allow UN inspectors in. That hasn't happened yet. The arrangements haven't been made yet. And as we heard from Vladimir Klitschko, they've made a lot of promises in the past, haven't they?
They have indeed, and we can only judge them by what happens rather than by the promises. But, the grain ships are now leaving Odessa, and that in one way is an illustration of the fact that common sense has penetrated into some areas of the Kremlin. So I think the nuclear power plant here is also another one, which is a double-edged sword for the Russians. If anything happened to that nuclear plant, it affects Russia as well. Prevailing winds would take any radioactivity from Zaporizhzhia right into the heartland of Russia. So there is a common interest involved here. And although it's difficult to trust anything that the Russians actually say, what they've done in the past, especially over the grain ships from Odessa, does tend to suggest that they look to their own self-interest before they look at the international interest.
What about the reports that we're hearing of strikes on Russian military targets in Crimea? The latest has apparently struck the base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. How do you assess what's going on there? Crimea, of course, has been in Russian hands since 2014. Do you think this is part of some kind of concerted offensive by Ukraine to regain that territory?
Well, the Ukrainians are fighting for survival. They're fighting for their lives, and they're fighting for the survival of the nation state as a whole. And they're doing so robustly and tenaciously, and they're doing it inventively as well. So they're not making claims about what's going on in Ukraine, in Crimea today, as well they might. But it can be that internal dissension inside Russia and inside Russian territories is now spilling over into the violence that we often see in conflict zones. So it's still a bit of a mystery. And I read the open source accounts that are available, and it is quite clear that some sabotage is taking place inside Russian occupied territories, and they're finding it difficult now to deploy troops from the front line, especially in the Donbass, in order to be able to deal with the new insurgencies that are taking place in and around Crimea. That can only be good news for the Ukrainians.
Nonetheless, Russia is now in control of about a fifth of Ukraine's territory. Let me ask you a bit more about NATO's response to the war. Right at the beginning of the invasion, NATO made it very clear they weren't going to get directly involved. Of course, Ukraine's not a NATO member. But are you at all concerned that saying that so specifically, saying that NATO would not get involved, do you think that perhaps gave a green light to President Putin?
No, it didn't at all. President Putin knows precisely what NATO is. It's a defensive alliance. It defends its members, member countries. It's not an aggressive organization, and this campaign and its help to the Ukrainians is for the defense of Ukraine and not an attack on Russia as a whole. Russia is a superpower. It has 7,000 nuclear weapons. It's a superpower militarily, not necessarily economically, and it's now suffering very substantially on the economic side. But President Putin knew right from the beginning that there was no question about NATO becoming involved in a war with Russia over Ukraine, but that the NATO countries would be giving robust support to Ukraine in its fight for survival.
And that robust support has included quite significant supplies of weapons from countries like the UK and the United States. I mean, how important do you think those contributions are, those weapons, the drones, the missiles and so on that have been provided? How significant is the contribution from the West?
It's a hugely important contribution, but it only matters if the Ukrainians are fighting for their own survival, and they're fighting really, really hard and really well. One of the reports I read this morning was pointing out that in the historic city of Odessa, which I remember myself visiting, there was a lot of people who were actually very pro-Russian. A lot of them were actually Russian citizens, but a lot of them were just simply pro the Russian Federation, but not anymore. The war by Putin on Ukraine means that even families are torn apart because people who live in Ukraine know that they're fighting for the survival of their nation, and the nation matters to them. Even those who were sympathetic to Russia in the past now recognize that this is a war of survival. So, I think that we have to see that in the context of giving them arms. They've been able to use that equipment remarkably well, and they've pushed back the great Russian Federation to an extent that people would never have thought before. They're retaking territory. They're challenging Russia in a serious way. In many ways, the deployment of the Russian forces at the moment gives lie to the idea that Putin feels that NATO is a threat.
So do you think that the Ukrainian forces, with that Western backup, can they actually take back territory? We've seen that happen in some places. But as I was saying, Russian forces now control a fifth of Ukraine's territory. Is there a realistic prospect of Ukraine actually regaining much of that ground which has been taken by the Russians?
Well, Carole, watch the terminology. You say that Russia controls 20% of Ukrainian territory. They occupy 20%. They don't really control it at all. And the bits that they control, they've destroyed. They've got huge amounts of ordnance, dumb bombs, which cause huge chaos, break all international humanitarian laws. And the old Roman adage of, you create a desert and you call it peace is exactly what's happening in parts of the Donbass today. They don't control it, they occupy it. And the Ukrainians are fighting tenaciously back. Now, I can't say whether they're going to win against a huge occupying force like the Russians, but they're fighting at the moment, and with our help, they believe that they can actually push the Russians back and push the Russians out. And it's really up to them to make the decision as to what needs to be done and what will be done in the end.
Let me ask you, sorry, Lord Robertson, we lost your line for a moment. Hopefully we've got you back with us. Do you think, though, that there is more that the West, the EU, the UK, the United States could be doing to ramp up the pressure on President Putin? Because it does seem as though he's finding ways round a lot of these sanctions, selling his goods and getting his supplies from China and other favourable nations to make up for the blockade or the economic sanctions that he's facing across much of the West.
Yes, there's more that we need to do, and we need to keep the issue on the front page. That's of critical importance. I've made the suggestion recently that the new Prime Minister elected in a fortnight's time needs to go to Kiev to show that the British people are still on side, and that it was not simply a Boris Johnson enterprise to support President Zelensky. But I also say that the new Prime Minister, whether it's Rishi or Liz Truss, should go with Keir Starmer, to show that it is not just the British government or the British Prime Minister that's on side with the Ukrainian people, but it's the British people as a whole. That would be a very important signal. The second thing I think the British government needs to do is to send emissaries, envoys, to the global south, what we call the global south. That's Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, India, and basically to get over the message that it matters to them as well, that borders cannot be changed simply by the use of force. Because at the moment, people in these countries, leaders in these countries, are sitting on the fence, not wanting to take the side of the West against the Russians. And they need to be told that actually the protection of frontiers from territorial aggression is in their interests as well. These are two things that I think the new government could do that would actually be a big signal, not only domestically, but internationally as well.
Well, whether an incoming Prime Minister would be prepared to travel alongside Sir Keir Starmer is perhaps questionable. But are you concerned that we haven't actually heard that much from either Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak about the war in Ukraine? They've talked about the cost of living crisis, which, as you rightly point out, is exacerbated by what's happening in Ukraine and the sanctions and so on. But we've heard very little about it from the two of them. And this is going to be a huge looming crisis for whoever moves into number 10, presumably Liz Truss, in September.
It's very, very worrying that they haven't said much during this very public brawl that's involved in picking the next Prime Minister of our country, because it is top of the agenda. All of the problems that will be on the new Prime Minister's desk emanate from what Vladimir Putin did on the 24th of February 6 months ago. And therefore, they've got to take a grip on the situation. They've got to push it right up the agenda if they're actually going to be able to do something about the aggression of Putin, but also to do with the other things like the cost of living and the energy prices that are going to affect the population of Britain as a whole. And going back to my idea about the Prime Minister going out with a leader of the opposition, it's been done before. Tony Blair and John Major went together to Dunblane after the massacre that took place there. And I, in the middle of the Kosovo conflict, took the Shadow Foreign Secretary and the Liberal Democrat spokesman and the chairman of the Defence Select Committee out to the conflict zone when we were fighting Slobodan Milosevic at that time. These were big signals, important signals that the issue, the conflict mattered more than just to the individual government ministers.
I'm going to bring in my co-host, Jack Blanchard.
Hello, Lord Robertson. I just want to take you back a little bit. You were obviously Secretary General of NATO around the turn of the century. Do you think in retrospect it was a mistake by NATO to try and sort of hug Vladimir Putin close when he first came to power, knowing now what we do?
No, it wasn't. I think we should have hugged him even closer and longer, because I think that might have had an influence and an effect on him. I think it was, around 2004, 2005, and certainly 2008 when the Bucharest summit said that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, that things started to go in the wrong direction. My profound belief when I was dealing with Vladimir Putin, and I met him 9 times, was that we needed to hug him close, in many ways just like the French did to the Germans, so that what happened between France and Germany twice in the last century didn't happen again. And I think we could have done that at that time, but I fear the American administration of that era wasn't really interested in doing business with the Russians, and I think we're now living the consequences of that.
And you're talking specifically, I guess, about that moment in 2008 when George Bush said he supported Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. That looks like a historic mistake now, does it to you?
Well, it was a mistake on 2 grounds. One was that neither country was anywhere near ready for NATO membership, certainly at that time. And secondly, it subverted the process of countries joining NATO. I used to lecture, the 7 countries who came into NATO under my supervision were all told that they had to basically pass a number of very clear tests before they would be considered. And all of them did, and all of them made very tough decisions in order to do that. So the 2008 decision, I think, was unwise. And it certainly rang alarm bells in the Kremlin, but it also subverted and undermined the process of NATO in large, which had been so successful up until then.
And given where we are now, does the West hold any blame for what's happened? I mean, of course, it was Putin that invaded. Do you think that things could have been differently and this could all have been avoided?
No, I think it's down to Vladimir Putin on his own. I don't think he even consulted his Security Council before he made the invasion plans. This is something that seems to have been stewing away in his mind in isolation during the pandemic, and he bears all of the responsibility for what has happened. And we've just got to hope that people round about him will eventually recognise that the future of Russia is going to be very bleak indeed, unless they stop threatening and trying to destroy Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in the way that they're doing just now.
Does he seem like a different man now to the one that you met so many times 10, 20 years ago?
Very, very different indeed. I stood beside him 20 years ago, almost to this day, when he said, explicitly, he said, Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state which will make its own decisions. And I got on well with them. The NATO-Russia Council was established with my chairmanship. We had a whole series of practical working groups looking at a whole range of issues, including some very sensitive areas at that time. So we were making good progress. And now we've got somebody who seems to have broken international law, the United Nations Charter, the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, all of these things of irrelevance because he wants to create some mythical greater Russia. So it's a very different man that's there to the one that I did good business with.